BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, and thanks for joining us for the Farming Today This Week podcast. I'm Caz Graham, and in this edition, the Prime Minister announces a new agreement with the EU.
This is the first UK-EU summit. It marks a new era in our relationship. And this deal is a win-win.
Well, less paperwork would be good news for meat and veg exporters.
Since Brexit, 1,200,000 export health certificates have been issued, costing the industry over £240 million. So the difference will be immense.
But does it mean the millions of pounds spent on border control posts have been a waste of taxpayers' money?
They are the white elephants of Brexit, really. The port sector built them at pace, at huge cost, expecting that they'd be able to recover some of those costs. We can't do that. We're left with a really bitter taste in our mouths.
Well, lots to talk about there. But before we get into all of that, fishermen in the southwest of England are reporting an invasion of octopuses turning up in lobster and crab pots. It's being blamed on warming waters and is good news for some fishermen who are catching and selling the octopuses, but disastrous for others. BBC Spotlight's Janine Jansen reports.
Fishermen here in Brixham are landing around 4 to 6 tonnes of octopuses every day, and they say the last time this happened was back in 1952.
It's thought they're coming here from Morocco, as Moroccans are reporting a shortage of them there. Barry Young is the managing director of Brixham Fish Market.
This is the Mediterranean octopus, and we know it's a Mediterranean octopus. It's got 6 legs and 2 arms. This year there has been an absolute invasion of them. But it's not so good for the inshore fishermen and the crab fishermen, because they are decimating the crab fishery at the minute. The crabs, the lobsters, the scallops, they're just decimating it.
In Plymouth, crab fisherman Brian Tapper is at his wits' end.
The octopus are ruining us. If it continues, we've probably got 5 or 6 weeks left before we close the factory. Then we have probably 2 months left before the boats get tied up, because we can't keep subsidising everything. There's just nothing there.
A local bylaw says in Devon some crab pots must have an escape hatch so that juvenile crabs can escape, but unfortunately so too can the octopuses.
The octopus are coming in the little side hatch in the entrance here, and it's like McDonald's for them. They're just sitting in there. When they're full, they'll go along a whole string of pots. They'll go through 50 pots. And all you'll get in here is empty shells, little small lobsters, little small crabs, nothing, even scallops. Scallops are they take the scallop in there to eat. It's almost like they're using it as a home because it's safe. And then once they've finished, off they go. Because they come out of this easy.
The Devon Fisheries and Conservation Authority has listened to concerns and has now agreed to temporarily allow fishermen to close the escape hatches, as long as they only fish for octopus and release any crabs or lobsters caught. Meanwhile, the effect on the shellfish industry this summer could be huge.
It will long term become a massive problem for restaurateurs to be able to source any shellfish.
That report from Janine Jansen in Brixham. Now, 5 years on from Brexit, the Prime Minister has reset the UK's trade relationship with the EU with a new wide-ranging deal. Since the UK formally left the EU in January 2021, it's been classed as what's called a third country trader, with food exports subject to new rules, inspections and bureaucracy. The government says it's cost hundreds of millions of pounds to the industry. So the announcement that the UK has agreed with the EU to deliver an agri-food deal establishing a UK-EU SPS zone is big news. SPS stands for Sanitary and Phytosanitary, and it's about the rules that govern food safety and animal and plant health. The UK and EU will now move towards an agreement which would reduce the paperwork and border checks involved in exporting foods like meat and dairy. Peter Hardwick, Trade Policy Advisor at the British Meat Processors Association, told Anna Hill that he thinks the deal is significant.
The intention, of course, is to have a situation where we align in such a way that we're no longer required to complete export health certificates and have border checks for the vast majority of the things we export. And the difference that will make is massive.
And what has it been like then exporting meat to the EU since Brexit?
Well, to put this in perspective, since Brexit, 1,200,000 export health certificates have been issued at 2.4 million certifier hours, costing the industry over £240 million. That is just the cost of certification. So the difference will be immense.
To achieve this SPS agreement, UK exporters will have to align on EU rules around things like production methods, use of pesticides. Does that mean a change for meat producers here at all?
Well, for meat producers, it means no change whatsoever. The simple reality is, in order to export to the European Union, your entire supply chain must be compliant with EU rules, which means that from the farm to the abattoir, to the cutting plant, to the vehicles that you use, the temperatures you move your goods at, the residues that you're tested for, etc., all have to be fully compliant. Not only fully compliant on the day we left the EU, but dynamically so. So really, all that's happening is we're no longer going to have to pay for certification and border checks to demonstrate something we're doing already.
What will this mean for Northern Ireland? Because Northern Ireland has remained part of the EU single market for goods, meaning there's been a trade border in the Irish Sea for goods travelling to and from Great Britain.
Businesses in Great Britain that are sending meat, in our case, to Northern Ireland for further processing, at the moment require an export health certificate exactly the same as they do for the EU. That will no longer be necessary because we will have agreed, provided this agreement goes through as it's been suggested, we will then be in a common veterinary area, a common SPS area with the EU, and those certificates will no longer be needed.
Does it generally mean that there'll be a lot more exports of meat, do you think, from the UK?
There is certainly the scope, and we know that there's been some drop-off in exports and those will recover, but it will also help hugely with our competitiveness, both in terms of cost and in terms of the flexibility and speed with which we can supply.
Peter Hardwick from the British Meat Processors Association. The SPS agreement has been welcomed by other food and farming bodies like the British Poultry Council and Salmon Scotland, but not everybody is happy. The Country Land and Business Association, the CLA, calls it a bad deal and says that having to align with EU standards is an unnecessary surrender of control. It's not just meat exports which will see changes. As we've reported many times, the export of live bivalve molluscs like mussels and oysters to the EU have been severely restricted since Brexit. But David Jarrett, CEO of the Shellfish Association of Great Britain, told Anna this redrawing of the trade rules means that the export of British bivalves could be back.
For the shellfish aquaculture sector, this could make a huge difference. Whilst we have been lobbying for this exact moment for a number of years, we had kind of given up on it actually happening. So we're quite relieved and pleased that it's going to happen.
This export ban has led to some shellfish producers going out of business. Will this come too late for some people?
I think it might for some, yes. It will take a huge amount of effort for those that have closed to reinvest. There's a healthy market in Europe for UK shellfish, mussels in particular, especially as the Italian and Spanish productions over the last couple of years has been challenged with mortalities caused by climate change. We are now seeing the south of England as being a sweet spot for shellfish aquaculture in the whole of Europe. And I think we will see investment in the sector now that this decision has been made.
David Jarrett from the Shellfish Association of Great Britain. The government has confirmed that exports of other British products that had been banned since leaving the EU, like fresh sausages and burgers and seed potatoes, will be able to resume once the SPS agreement is reached. As we've been following on Farming Today, the seed potato industry was badly hit. Prior to Brexit, around 30,000 tonnes of British seed potatoes were exported annually into that market, mainly from Scotland. Seed potatoes are the tubers that you use to grow new potatoes from. Robert Doig, farmer director of Caledonia Potato, says that this is exciting news, but that recovery won't happen quickly.
I think everybody's going to have to take some time, because the lead-in time for production for sales, because some of the varieties will be different that we need to produce. We've lost the varieties that we used to sell to the EU. Some of these will need to be replaced. And the one thing that we would really want to be sure of is that there is continuity in this, that some of the things that have been politically threatened, like, we'll cancel this deal again if we get into power. Businesses can't plan with that sort of uncertainty, because it would take us a couple of years at least to rebuild up the products that we need to sell to the EU if we're going to sell to the EU.
We heard a couple of weeks back that you'd been engaged in a dialogue with the EU about standards. Do you think it's going to be easy to resume trade?
No. Well, it depends a lot on the actual details of the agreement that get made. I mean, at the moment we have agreement in principle. Small amounts of trade could happen quite quickly. Larger amounts, to get back to where we were, will probably take 3 or 4 years. Therefore, we need long-term confidence in this in order for people to make those investments that will get that trade back.
Potato grower Robert Doig. Well, the new SPS agreement with the EU was only sealed after a deal was done on fishing, which has been described by some fishing organisations as absolutely disastrous. It means the current situation, where EU boats have access to UK waters, will last until 2038. The UK will continue to agree yearly quotas of catches with the EU and Norway and issue licences controlling who fishes in its waters. Shetland is Scotland's second busiest fish market, and more fish are landed there than in England, Wales and Northern Ireland combined. BBC reporter there, John Johnson, sent us this report.
I'm looking out across a very busy harbour in Lerwick. Freshly caught haddocks, whiting and cod are sold across the UK and into Europe through the electronic auction here. In front of me, the huge pelagic trawlers that fish for herring and mackerel are tied up at the pier. Crews on board the whitefish boats beside me are getting ready to go to sea, and there's a handful of shellfish boats that have just returned from catching crabs, lobsters and scallops. A deal to allow European fishing vessels continued access to UK waters for a further 12 years is worrying fishermen here. Daniel Lawson is Executive Officer with the Shetland Fishermen's Association. And Daniel, what is the concern here in the islands?
Well, I detect a bit of a mix really among the fish catching fleet here. There's resigned sadness. Of course, fishermen know the words to this sad song. They've heard it before. On the other hand, frustration, real frustration, that once again our government have completely failed to grasp the opportunities that were at play here, and now those opportunities are wasted.
Do you think that the industry has been used as a bargaining chip here?
I think that's fairly evident from the deal that we see. The arrangement that was agreed following Brexit paved the way for annual negotiations with fisheries between the UK and the EU. Instead, we've ended up with a 12-year deal, and that completely forgoes the leverage that UK would have in an annual negotiation, because the EU fleet are much more reliant on UK waters than vice versa.
But the UK government argue there'll be no change to current access to fish stocks, no reduction in UK quota, or an increase in quota for boats from Europe fishing and what they're allowed to catch. So are we not just maintaining the status quo here?
The feeling is just that we have lost so much potential here as a nation, this national asset, the rich fishing grounds that we have, particularly around Shetland, that attracts that EU fleet every year, that could have been held up and bargained, and we could have had real gains for the industry. And instead, we've been used as the bargaining chip. The government spin is that, well, trade it will be easier and exporting fish will be easier and cheaper. That's all to the good. But when you read the detail of this agreement, the UK is paying a financial contribution towards that trade agreement.
But the UK government has also pledged to invest, £360 million in the fishing industry. That's going to go towards new technology, equipment to modernise the fleet, help upskill the workforce, and an agreement, as you mentioned there, to reduce red tape in exporting the fresh seafood here from the pier into Europe.
I think with the best will in the world, John, and not being funny, the opportunity that we've lost in terms of fishing rights, quotas, access is worth more than that. And this fleet you see out here is capable of bringing in that level of investment by itself without costing the taxpayer if they had been given the opportunity to do so.
Daniel Lawson speaking to John Johnson in Shetland for Farming Today. Well, the DEFRA Secretary, Steve Reed, was asked about the fishing deal this week by MPs on the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. And he told them that he thought it was a better deal than it would have been if the EU had had its way.
I think this is a reasonably good deal for the UK fishing sector. Compared to what some of the speculation was, and indeed some of the pressures on our negotiating team, the EU were interested in more quota, more access to EU territorial waters. They were looking for a deal on fishing in perpetuity, and they were trying to achieve that by making what I felt was a spurious link between fishing and an SPS deal. Our negotiating team held absolutely firm. And as a result of that, we have a deal for 12 years, which if you compare to what the fishing sector has had for the last few years, we're rolling over the best of the years that the fishing sector has had under the previous government's deal.
And the Secretary of State added that fish exports to the EU will become easier because a new SPS agreement, once agreed, would reduce the paperwork and border checks on foods like fish, meat and dairy. Chair of the EFRA committee, Alistair Carmichael, asked if border control posts that have been set up since Brexit to handle those checks on imports might now be downscaled or even dismantled. Emily Miles, a senior civil servant at DEFRA, replied.
Once the deal is done, the final arrangements are sorted, we're expecting there will be a scaling back of some checks. So there will be a decommissioning of some facilities. We need to work through where and how. The consequences of having fewer checks on food coming in means that there won't need to be as many checks done at the border, so we'll need less. What we mustn't do is decrease the ability to look at illegal imports. The checks, a lot of the facilities that got built for Brexit were for trade, people who want to be compliant. So
this is properly traded, imported commercial imports, not personal use.
Yeah, exactly.
And the border target operating model, fruit and veg sector are currently gearing up for additional checks on the 1st of July. Should they continue with that?
So the question of the 1st of July is under active consideration. I think that's the phrase.
Well, I mean, we're sitting here on the 20th of May. The 1st of July is not very far away. What should they be doing? Or should they be preparing for something on the 1st of July that they're then going to have to ditch on the 1st of September?
At the moment, in law, the 1st of July checks have to come in. We're reviewing that, and we need government to agree if that's going to proceed.
That's Emily Miles, Director General for Food, Biosecurity and Trade at DEFRA. Following that admission that some facilities could be decommissioned, the British Ports Association is calling on the government for compensation to the tune of £120 million, describing the border control posts as the white elephants of Brexit. Richard Ballantyne is the Chief Executive of the British Ports Association.
Around 43 ports received funding from the UK government to build these things called border control posts, and a host of other port authorities and port terminals invested in facilities so that UK officials could inspect and carry out frontier-type duties when the UK left the EU. The total cost of those border control post facilities at the 40 or so port terminals was around 200 million funding from the government, and then an additional 120 or so million that the industry put in itself for capital costs. Since then, because a lot of these facilities have not either been utilised fully or are being slowly cranked up to be used, we anticipate that for a larger border control post, so something that has around 15 or so bays that lorries can reverse into and unload their goods and products, etc., for inspections, it's around £200,000 a year just to manage those facilities with energy, security, safety and all the other things, business rates, etc. So there was a big capital cost, but there's also ongoing operational costs.
Just remind us as well, where does the inland border facility at Sevington in Kent fit into all of that? Who paid for that and what do you think is going to happen to it?
Yes, indeed. This is obviously is interesting and significant news for the inland border facility in Kent. Sevington itself. I think the figure that was spent on that was getting on for $500 million of public sector funding. What happens to that, we're not quite sure, but presumably a lot of the actual space itself is now redundant. Of course, other controls, customs-related controls, safety and security controls on trade can be carried out at that and other facilities. The UK Border Force has a presence at certain locations. So we're in a bit of a difficult situation where it's not a clear sort of, we don't need that facility at all. There were certain other things built into them, but the bulk of the checks to be carried out at border control posts and inland border facilities were animal and agri-food related products, which basically, having a common SPS agreement with the EU negates the need for that at all.
What do you think needs to happen? Are you looking for compensation for your ports from the government? Because obviously ports have put a stack of money into this, haven't they?
Absolutely. I mean, the ports have invested in good faith and under the direction of government. So we are now talking to government and asking government about compensatory measures. They are the white elephants of Brexit, really. I mean, it was the messaging from the previous administration was that we have to have these facilities to facilitate international trade movements of certain type and variety. So the port sector built them at pace, at huge cost to our industry, etc., expecting that they'd be able to recover some of those costs from the actual use operation by levying charges on importers, etc. We can't do that. We're left with a really bitter taste in our mouths about what this whole process means for our sector.
Richard Ballantyne from the British Ports Association. And it's not just ports that have paid out considerable sums of money for the anticipated post-Brexit testing regime. Some fresh produce companies invested in building their own facilities for checking EU produce coming into the country. Nigel Jenny is the CEO of the Fresh Produce Consortium.
Like others, we are calling for compensation from the government because these businesses have spent hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds of their own money to build facilities by the encouragement of two successive governments now that ultimately in a few months, but we don't quite know when, will become obsolete.
Can you give me your overall reaction to the EU-UK trade agreement?
I think, well, be clear, we don't have an agreement yet. We have a commitment to discuss and agree something. The details are not finalised at this moment in time. So in some respects, we would welcome the opportunity with some caution. It should be positive for many businesses that trade from the UK and from Europe in terms of fruit and vegetables, cut flowers and plants. However, there is a cost to this in terms of the cost that businesses have already incurred, including those control points, but also it would appear that we are going to adopt EU legislation which could well impact on our trade with the rest of the world countries as well.
And can you give us an example of that?
Well, for example, if you take citrus, at the moment, if I'm buying citrus from South Africa or America or Egypt or many other countries, there are no border controls because they're not considered to be a biosecurity risk to the UK. Yet, if you accept we will adopt the EU regulations, many of those consignments will be subject to 100% inspection. So every single consignment that arrives in the UK will be stopped at the border and physically checked, causing delay, cost and disruption to the whole industry.
This is very early days. While looking at this agreement, the government hasn't confirmed that is what is going to happen. Do you think? Well,
it hasn't confirmed and it hasn't denied. It would be very easy to deny the position. Surely this is about a discussion between the UK and the EU. It should not have the potential liability to impact trade with other countries, especially when these goods which will arrive from other countries will be consumed in the UK. They will not be consumed in Europe.
Nigel Jenny from the Fresh Produce Consortium. In a statement, a government spokesperson told us this government committed in its manifesto to negotiate an agreement to prevent unnecessary border checks, remove red tape for businesses and help tackle the cost of food, which is what we have delivered on. And closing border control posts will depend on the final shape of a deal. And that's all we've got time for today. Do listen in on Monday for a Farming Today programme all about nocturnal wildlife in the North Pennines and Cumbria, and also for a special bank holiday edition of Woman's Hour at 10 o'clock here on BBC Radio 4, where Anita Rani will be on a dairy farm in Devon, exploring the reality of female farmers' lives. I'm Caz Graham. The producers were Heather Simons and Beatrice Fenton, and Farming Today this week is a BBC Audio Bristol production.